So, Mark, just a few questions for you to begin with, really. First of all, just explain a little bit about your own chaplaincy context, because you're a practicing chaplain as well as another role, which we'll come to in a minute. But just what's your chaplaincy context at the moment?
Yeah, so I mostly work in an acute hospital, which is in Sheffield. So it's a large teaching hospital. I think it's probably the second biggest trust in the country. I think it debates that with Leeds and possibly some of the London hospitals, but hospitals keep merging and joining together, so that probably changes over time. But it's a large acute teaching hospital, so we have lots of medics coming and training. So it's lots of good opportunities there for linking with staff and staff support, as well as the work with patients. Sheffield's a funny city in some ways in terms of the way the healthcare is set up. So there are 5 children's hospitals in the country, Great Ormond Street obviously being the one that people are most familiar with. So Sheffield also has a dedicated children's hospital. So we have this funny situation where people, a baby can be born in the hospital where I work, they go home, and then if the baby is unwell, their care gets taken over by the children's hospital, so they then go to another hospital, and then we get at 16, sort of 17 children having to transfer back into adult acute care, and obviously finding very different environments. So that's it just gives you an interesting perspective on things. And then I also do a very little bit in the hospice here in Sheffield, which is called St Luke's. And they would be very keen for me to say that they were the first hospice outside of London to be established. That's their sort of claim to fame.
Okay, well, thank you. So your other role is to be secretary for health chaplaincy for the Free Churches group. And now some people on the Zoom call will be very familiar with the Free Churches group because, for example, if they're a prison chaplain, they have to engage with the FCG. Others won't know what the Free Churches group is at all. So, Mark, just tell us just briefly what the Free Churches group is and what your role within that is.
Yeah, so I view the Free Churches group, I think, as an umbrella organisation is obviously often the best way to describe it. So it's currently 27 national churches that come from a free church tradition. So obviously not the Church of England, not the Roman Catholic Church, but a range of others. So those that would be like the Baptist Church, the sort of traditional Protestant denominations, and then more recently, lots of Pentecostal and Black-led churches. So yes, I think we're currently 27 churches, and it gives the opportunity to have more of a collective voice and representation. And then I suppose some of my role in that in terms of supporting chaplains, so particularly some of the smaller denominations may only have 1 or 2 healthcare chaplains. So very difficult for them to put on a day like today. So I can provide opportunities for all of those health, and I often talk about health and social care chaplains, because we've got chaplains who are working in, particularly in the Methodist Homes Association, in their care homes, and others who'll be working in healthcare settings that aren't a hospital or sort of GP practice. So there's a sort of grey area between sort of health and social care.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I suppose I think of my role in 2 ways. One is that aspect of support, putting on training events, reflective practice opportunities, a mix of things, so that there's those CPD opportunities for chaplains. And then the second part is engaging at a national level. I sometimes use the term agitating at a national level. I quite like that notion of just trying to keep things on agendas that I and the Free Church group and the members of the Free Church group think are important. So sort of, pushing for good quality chaplaincy to be recognised by particularly the NHS and supported.
And just take from either of those roles, Mark, any particular, very brief, any particular highlight maybe that's happened recently that you just might want to share about?
Yes, this didn't actually happen to me, but it was a colleague who bumped into someone recently. So we'd had a a patient that we've been supporting in the hospital probably a couple of years ago now, I think, who had been through a really tough time, had a range of drug addictions and other things, and we'd supported them. They'd started to explore sort of faith, spirituality, and we'd been able to link them with a church before we left, which was great. But then, and that's one of the things that I find, that you often then no idea what happens next in the narrative. But my colleague said it was Good Friday, they were walking along the road and they nearly got run over by someone on a bike, who then looked at them and said their name, and she looked blankly at them. Said, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And she admitted that she didn't. And then they said that this was this person who we supported, and they had obviously been completely transformed, so to the point of not really being recognised, and talked about how well they were, how they'd been off the drugs for the last 2 years, really well supported by a local church, was volunteering with the church in a community centre that they run. So yeah, real encouragement there that lives do get turned around, and God can come and make a difference to people.
Yeah, fantastic. Sometimes I suppose you do a lot of things, but you don't get that feedback. Great to hear when you do.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, we'll hand over to you. Our title for the next hour or so, we've got this topic of ritual and liturgy in everyday encounters. I think we're going to use breakout rooms a couple of times for people to discuss some of the things you raise. Just want to say, people, if you do want to use a chat, please do. And I might appear as a disembodied voice every now and again if Mark invites me to introduce anything from the chat. But Mark, over to you, and do lead us in this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to just try to share my screen, which hopefully works. And I can see some thumbs up, which is great. So yeah, so thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. My aim is to spend a bit of time exploring the term ritual, just to think about how it might be defined, how we understand what ritual is, what's the sort of point of it. Thinking then from that definition about what may or may not count as ritual. And then I want to share with you one way that I find helpful of thinking about what happens when someone is suffering in some way. And then in the last part, to think about how liturgy and ritual might be one way of responding to that suffering. In what I present, I'll be sharing from my experience as a healthcare chaplain, but particularly in the last part, there'll be opportunity to move into breakout rooms to discuss how you might find some of the ideas I've been presenting applying to your context. So I hope there will be plenty of resonances, and my sense is that there are links and you'll be able to make those connections. So before I move on to that, let me just see if I can, yes, that works, that it moves through. Just why might we think about ritual in the first place? So Chris Swift, who is currently the Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at the Methodist Homes Associations, and was a chaplain at Leeds previously. He wrote his doctoral thesis in part based on what he termed autoethnography, which is basically a posh way of saying he reflected on what he did and then wrote about it. So looking at the work that he did as a chaplain, he wrote that others in a healthcare setting do not have this ability to handle ancient words and invent a few new ones on occasions. And I would imagine that that might be said for most, if not all, of the contexts where you find yourself, that there aren't other people who play with ancient words and invent new ones. And so if that is a unique skill, the artistry required in handling liturgy and ritual, I think provides a key reason for the employment of chaplains, rather than just someone who is a good listener. And that's obviously important, but I think that's a key thing for to argue for the importance of chaplains. And then this isn't an essay, but I can remember being told about the importance of defining my terms, and we will look at liturgy and ritual in a moment. So what do we mean by everyday encounters? Well, we're thinking here about the encounters where we provide pastoral care, rather than just simply bumping into someone in the street or meeting them socially as a friend. But we're not thinking that this has to be some sort of complicated, very much on the edge of what happens. So they are my thinking, the everyday encounters that we have with people when we are offering them support. And this is just one of my favorite definitions of pastoral care. It comes from Guy Harrison, who is a mental health chaplain, and he defines pastoral care as theologically informed care that is concerned to respond to human distress wherever it is found, especially when that distress leads to a loss of hope in the transforming nature of love. And I particularly like that last part, when someone has lost hope in the transforming nature of love, that's where we can step in. So yes, pastoral care, supporting someone who is in some way experiencing distress. So that's a long preamble. What then of ritual? So firstly, to say that particularly when writing about chaplaincy, liturgy and ritual often come together as a pairing, but from an anthropological perspective, ritual is normally viewed as the larger catch-all category, which would include liturgy as part of it. And liturgy would be seen as relating to the spoken, the sort of said parts of a service. And that's the same whether it's something that's written down in a sort of formal way, or if something is said much more extempore. That would all sort of count as the liturgy part. The Cambridge Dictionary describes ritual as a way of doing something which is the same, in which the same actions are done in the same way every time. And most dictionary definitions are along those lines. They refer to a series of actions performed according to a prescribed order. And often they will then link it to some form of religious or solemn ceremony. Roy Rappaport, who is an anthropologist, and I will return to some of his work as we go through, he uses this definition, slightly different, but the similarities there. He says ritual is the performance of more or less invariant sequences of formal acts and utterances, not entirely encoded by the performers. Now that's an academic definition, if ever I heard one. But I invite you just to think back to the various public markings and mournings of the death of Queen Elizabeth and the proclaiming of Charles as king, as a way of thinking and about what Roy Rappaport is getting at. So in those proclamations, we saw the same words and actions, the more or less invariant sequences of formal acts and utterances, being carried out in different places and at different times. And these acts and utterances were carried out by groups or individuals, the performer or the performers, who hadn't they hadn't encoded the acts and utterances themselves, but were using a form that had been handed down to them. So I think that's perhaps hopefully a hopeful way of understanding that sort of definition, putting, I guess, some sort of meat on its bones in that way. And when Rappaport uses the word formal, he's meaning ritual has a form that is followed, and he uses that to distinguish it from what might be termed functional descriptions. That would be descriptions that define ritual by what it does, or substantive definitions, defining ritual in terms of who it's believed the content is for. So in this sense, ritual is always formal in that it has a form that's followed, but that doesn't equate to it being solemn necessarily. So while ritual, as it was in the marking of the death of the Queen, will often be part of a formal occasion, it can be much more informal. And Rappaport himself describes the greeting behaviour of teenagers as saying that it is formal in terms that it has a stereotype pattern that's followed, but it's not often or always solemn or restrained. And I would wonder if that perhaps charismatic worship might equally be viewed in that way, that there may be a pattern, but it isn't necessarily solemn or restrained. This then slightly different way of coming at ritual, and this is given by Ronald Grimes, and he defines ritual as sequences of ordinary actions rendered special by virtue of their condensation, elevation, or stylization. So we have that same aspect there of the sequences. So we have the more or less invariant utterances and acts that Rappaport talks about. But he says that as well as that aspect, there needs to be something extra to make ritual, to make something be able to be defined as ritual. So it needs to be special or strange in some way. So something that's out of the sort of the normal. And this is according to him because rituals often consist of normal everyday acts, but there is a twist to them. So he gives the example of one person talking to another who they cannot see. We do that on the phone. That wouldn't be a ritual. But if you pray, then that starts to become a ritual because there's an aspect that has made that conversation estranged or special in some way. He also talks about people washing themselves and as being a good habit that would be there in any society. And then I guess this is particularly appropriate for talking to Baptists. He says when people immerse themselves in water with their clothes on and invoke an invisible presence of the spirit, the ritual becomes, well, the act becomes the ritual we call baptism. And then I guess just one extra way to think about that, again, which picks up on the idea of normal actions becoming strange, is that the actions or the series of actions cannot be justified by a sort of rational means to an end explanation. So in this sense, the custom of shaking hands in greeting is a ritual, but the act of planting potatoes would not be a ritual. Though that, of course, doesn't mean that you might not plant potatoes in a ritualistic way with the hope that it will produce a better harvest. But I hope that gives some sort of sense of what we're talking about and what we mean when we're talking about ritual. So if that's how ritual might be defined, what is the sort of point of ritual? Why might we use it? Most modern anthropologists would agree that culturally defined sets of behavior or ritual can function as a language, even if they disagree whether ritual is always the right term for that. And this is the view of Roy Rappaport. And he argues that ritual is a form of communication. He says that ritual is not simply an alternative way to express any manner of thing, but that certain meanings and effects can best or even only be expressed or achieved in ritual. And developing that, he writes that ritual's efficacy, or the way that ritual works and does things, might be understood as physical through the deployment of matter and energy, or it might be more meaningful, which would be grounded in principles of communications. But in then one of my favorite quotes, he carries on to say that to distinguish between the domains in which the physical and the meaningful prevail is not to declare that the boundary between them is sharp or clear. It is unlikely that any sea has ever been parted by prayer or turned back by command. and then particularly relevant for next month, and we may be equally confident that no prince has ever been transformed into a king, no man and woman into husband and wife by matter and energy alone. And then this is the bit I particularly like, but prayer as well as drugs may have an effect upon the physical well-being of those praying and even upon the health of those for whose sake prayer is offered. That's quite a lot in there, but effectively he's saying that when we use ritual, things happen that might not otherwise be able to be happened or to be expressed. And I think particularly in a pastoral situation, some of that's well summed up by a quote from Ewan Kelly, who was a healthcare chaplain working up in Scotland. And he says that ritual is a mechanism by which people's wrestlings and searchings and struggling can be verbalized and validated by other or others and acted out by some, if not all. So unless there's anything particularly in the chat that's popped up around ritual, I will move on just to now to think a bit more about engaging with people when they are suffering.
Nothing in the chat at all at the moment, Mark, so carry on, but folks do put things in if you wish to.
Great, thanks. So this next little bit, I want to start us just to think about a way of understanding the needs that people have when they are suffering or in distress in some ways. This is a framework that comes from a healthcare context, but I think it can be much broader in its application. And again, while the examples that I give will be from my healthcare experience, I hope they find resonances with your experience, and we will have that opportunity in breakout rooms in a little bit to try to make some of those connections between yourselves. It's a framework that comes from the writing of Edmund Pellegrino and David Thomasma in a book that's called Helping and Healing. They are both from the USA, and they were both Roman Catholic in terms of their faith. Pellegrino was a physician and a philosopher of medicine who pioneered the development of the study of medical humanities. And Thomasma was a medical ethicist who also had postgraduate qualifications in Catholic theology. And the book is really their attempt to present, I suppose, a Christian philosophy of medicine, setting out what kind of person a healthcare professional should be and what might constitute healing in the widest sense of the term. But before they explore healing and how someone should be, they set out their understanding of what happens when a person suffers. And they suggest they experience these four things. So they say, firstly, that they experience what they term finitude, the intimation or the awareness of their own mortality. And for a number of people who I meet in the hospital, they're becoming ill or having injured themselves in some ways can often be the trigger for them to reflect on their mortality. They become aware in a particularly real way, or perhaps for the first time, that sooner or later, death will catch up with them. And perhaps similar things play out when it is a loved one who is ill and someone realizes that they are going to die and they will lose them. And that might also reflect then on their own mortality. Secondly, they talk about experiencing vulnerability. They say you become exposed to the power of others. I guess particularly obviously in surgery, someone can very literally put their life in another person's hands. But there are always power dynamics associated within healthcare settings, and I would argue within any pastoral care encounter when we come alongside someone around who does and doesn't have control. And we were talking before this session a little bit about proselytizing and talking around whose ground are we on. And and people in the hospital are always quite vulnerable. We come onto their ground, but they are in a place where so much of the control that they might have in most of their lives has been taken away. And in fact, I can remember a conversation with a charge nurse who'd previously been in the armed forces. And he spoke about how many of the things that they do, or they did in the forces in terms of interrogation, to try to disrupt someone and to sort of break them down, are the same things that they do in the hospital, but for the best sort of intentions, but inevitably has some of those side effects. So in a hospital, a patient may well be told when they can eat. It's only when the meals come round. There'll be that limited choice. They might only be able to have a sort of cup of tea, again, when the drinks trolley comes around, so their life is controlled. If they're not able to get out of bed very easily, again, when they go to the toilet, all of those things, when they can wash, all of that will be controlled. And then even for the best of reasons, their sleep may well be disrupted. Plenty of people calling out, potentially people talking in a corridor, or simply the fact that someone comes to check their blood pressure or whatever else it is every few hours, so that they become at the sort of power, vulnerable to the power that the institution in that way has over them. I can imagine, particularly perhaps with prison chaplaincy, there would be resonances there for when you are a person is under the power of the state, and their life is very limited and controlled. Moving then on to the third one, and what they call dissolution. They talk about the fracturing of someone's sense of their own personhood, their sense of self. I wonder how often you might have heard someone who you've been involved in supporting talk about how they were always the person who cared for others, and now that they no longer feel themselves, particularly because they are, and this again relates to the previous point, that they are now being cared for. So they no longer feel who they thought they were. I remember again fairly early on when I started listening to someone who was the church treasurer, and they told me in great details about the church finances, and I can remember sort of walking away, partly sort of thinking, well, that's 20 minutes of my life I'm never going to get back, but then reflecting more deeply on it and realizing that they were really trying to connect to their own sense of personhood. Doing the church finances was the thing that really gave them meaning, gave them purpose, and here they were in hospital, unable to fulfill that role. So telling me about it was a way to connect themselves back to their sense of self. I also hear people in the hospital talking about no longer being able to trust their own body, particularly if they've got some illness, or feeling that like their body has let them down in some way. So they lose that sense of self. And then disruption, lastly, a disruption of their normal family and community life. And again, very obviously, if someone is admitted to hospital, they are removed from their normal context, their normal setting. But even if someone is at home and is ill, it's likely they'll be unable to do at least some of their normal social activities. And they may struggle to play the role that they normally do in a family. And as I've noted there, while they are described as those four areas, there is an inevitable linking and overlapping between them. I shared these thoughts a few months ago with students at Regent's Theological College. And Bob Wilson was reflecting after I'd shared this bit, that we can see all of those four things happening with COVID. COVID very much made people aware of their own mortality. I don't think my children have ever washed their hands so well when sort of coming into the house, or perhaps washed it so many times. Lockdowns exposed us to the power of the state telling us what we could and couldn't do, how far we were able to go out to exercise, how long we could exercise for, whether we could open our churches or not, and those aspects there. That, of course, meant that our normal work and our social routines were stopped. And not surprisingly, given that, I think many people felt that loss of their own sense of personhood, their own sense of who they were, what they were about. And I suspect that there is a collective societal suffering at both sort of macro and micro levels that we perhaps haven't really well responded to. And those things are perhaps playing under the surface in lots of our communities. So I hope that as I've talked through those and given some examples from my experience, that there's been some resonances for you, and maybe there's been sort of those thoughts popping into your mind, sort of saying, oh yes, that will be a bit like when I'm doing, or when I've heard this person. But what I want to give you now is to share a bit about where you might see those connections between those aspects of suffering and the context that you work in. Perhaps, yeah, maybe sort of 7 to 10 minutes, and then draw you back. So I hope you found some connections between what I was saying and the context that you work in. I'm going to pick up now and think about how we respond to that suffering that people are experiencing. So Pellegrino and Thomas More say that for each item they need to be responded to, or it to be, I quite like to say they need to be transformed in some way, but some unfortunately they use the word transformed for the first one, so I can't sort of use it for all of them, but realistically that's how I think about it. Each of those aspects of suffering needs to be sort of transformed, to be turned around in some way. So they say that finitude needs to be transformed. They talk about overcoming vulnerability, so that vulnerability needs to be overcome in some way. They say that personhood needs to be reassembled, and then the person reinserted back into community. And my belief is that ritual, particularly in the form of the liturgy and the rites, the words and actions that a chaplain can offer, provides one way to respond to each of those items. So what I want to do for the rest of this session is share a little bit more about what Pellegrino and Thomas More say for each of those areas, to give you some examples again from my context. And then, as we've just done, invite you back into those breakout groups to again make those connections to your own context. So firstly, transforming finitude. Obviously, as Pellegrino and Thomas More acknowledged, there can be no literal overcoming of our mortality. Each of us will die. Instead, they talk of a more metaphorical overcoming. They describe life as like a sacred torch being passed on to other generations, and talk about how healing can be a transcendent experience. And I think the word sort of transcendence there is a really interesting word. I think it's important to make a distinction in my mind between transcending something, which might be sort of something that's more, it goes beyond it, and what might be termed an escape, or an inappropriate sort of escaping or pretending that something isn't happening, that reality isn't as it is. And they talk about how transcendence is not that quality of a person jumping out of the limits of the bonds of human finitude. And I guess very obviously for those who have a belief of life after death, that religious rituals can help remind someone of or connect them to that transcendent dimension. Now that might be done through a formal service, sharing communion with someone in a hospital, but it might also be some very simple and gently worded prayers with someone. And this perhaps picks up in Amanda. I noticed your comment in the chat, and I'll pick this up a bit more when we get to the questions at the end. But it might be some very simple, gently worded prayers that hand the situation over to God's keeping. And if we think of that link to God as being a sort of a vertical transcendence, there's also what we might term a horizontal transcendence, and this might link a little bit with your question, Amanda, of how people are connected to those things that go beyond the everyday, but don't necessarily have a focus on the divine, and that might be whether or not someone has a faith. I can remember talking to my supervisor when I first started work in the hospice, and we were talking around some of this aspect of transcending, and he was telling me about visiting a retired minister, and he said most of the conversations that they had were actually about this minister's model train set, because he'd done all the sort of the big transcendent about, you know, where is God, where are you with God in this situation. He'd done all that work, and what actually needed was that sense of him being taken beyond the immediacy of what was happening. And in some ways, I think this would have had a strong linking with, you know, being connecting to his sense of self as well, because he was having those conversations about those things that were important to him. Then secondly, overcoming vulnerability. There can be a profound mutuality within any chaplain patient or any chaplain other person relationship that we have. Ewan Kelly writes, both are human beings who may learn from or be changed by their encounter. But I think it's always important to remember that there are power imbalances when we're involved in caring for someone. And again, I think some of the conversations before this session, when thinking about proselytizing and the offering of prayer, we have to remember, if we say to someone, would you like prayer, who is under our power in some way because of this sort of institutional setting, it may be quite hard for them to say no when it might not be entirely what they want. There's something important, I think, for the way that we can give back agency to people. It's something when I started thinking about this that I started doing, and others of you may have been doing this for a long time already. But when I take communion to a patient on a ward, generally, if they are sort of obviously well enough to, I ask them if they would like to choose or to do the reading when we get to that point. It's a very small way of giving them back some agency, some control, and for them to be a partaker of and not just be on the receiving end. That's a reminder there that liturgy, ritual aren't simply things that we do to others, but they're things that they can participate in of their own accord. So maybe something as simple as offering someone a holding cross, giving them a finger labyrinth that they can use, is a way to give them an element of control back, to help give them the ability to make use of their own spiritual resources. So then the third of the tasks of Pellegrino and Thomasma, they say, is about reassembling personhood. Now, they wrote their book in the 1990s, so I hope that medicine has moved on from examples of staff reducing a person to an object, you know, talking about the broken leg in bed 4 or the kidney stones in bay 5. Although when I shared some of this at the College of Healthcare Chaplains conference, there was a laugh which suggests it's not always moved on as much as we would like. But even where people are taken much more seriously as whole people, the reality is that much medicine still focuses on the physical, so it can have that tendency to objectify. Chaplains I think, should be natural champions of holistic care of whatever settings we're in, but particularly in health care settings. Notions of personhood, I think, should be core to much of what we do. And it's interesting, this is a quote from Pellegrino and Thomasma, who say, healing occurs through physical means, from touch to high technology, from combing a patient's hair to heart transplant surgery. On their own, such physical interventions can often cure, but to heal, these interventions must come through other persons. Only persons can effectively heal other persons, which I think is a really powerful quote. And that leads me just for some reflections on touch. So rituals clearly do involve words. A carefully worded prayer, as I've talked about, that articulates and verbalizes a person's longings through careful listening may help connect them to their sense of self. But there's other things that happen. When I'm teaching people about the role of a chaplain in healthcare, I sometimes say that if you followed a chaplain around, you might get to the end of the day and say, well, chaplains, they go and visit people, they spend time listening to them, then they make them cry, and then they leave. Because it's often that last point when I've offered something back in prayer that's articulated some of what they've been saying, some of their hopes and fears, that they know themselves to have been heard, to be listened to. But I'd also want to just caution what I term here a run to prayer, and not using that to close off difficult or uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes just to try to stick with someone in their difficulty and in their uncomfortableness. So when someone says something that we find uncomfortable, to be able to try to say, well, tell me more about that, as opposed to, well, shall we pray about it? Which isn't a bad response in itself, but it does shut that conversation down. But yes, and then as I was saying about the use of touch and action, certainly in a hospital, and I can imagine in quite a few other settings, much touch that happens is not therapeutic. So how might our touch help see someone whole? Again, at the College of Healthcare Chaplains conference, when I shared some of this, we had some interesting conversations about whether reaching out and gently holding someone's hand is a ritual. Is a fist bump given to a teenager as a chaplain comes on to a mental health ward a ritual? I would argue, based on some of the definitions earlier, that they may well be, particularly if those things that are everyday actions in some ways, but have been made special, have been made strange. They communicate things that can't always be put into words. They articulate aspects of personhood, of recognizing someone as a whole person. And so far, those actions are elevated in my mind, and therefore might be viewed as a form of ritual. And again, I mentioned earlier the death of the Queen. I could see the viewing of the Queen's coffin as a ritual action, but maybe so also was the queue, and how British in some ways that we had queues to join the queue. But maybe there were aspects of that tap into things that are sort of formal and time-honoured within our society, the notions of queuing, notions of pilgrimage that were at play there. So those everyday actions becoming special, becoming elevated in some way. And then lastly, reinserting the person into community. So Pellegrino and Thomasma say that true healing does not take place until the sick person has been restored to some level of functioning in their community. And I'm always think of the Gerasene demoniac when I read that quote, and who wants to follow Jesus, but Jesus says, no, you must stay and return to your community. Your community that has ostracized you must learn to accept you back. I love that picture. It could work for so many of those aspects of sort of not feeling yourself at one level. But I chose it here partly for that sense of how a community responds to someone who is ill and how accepting they might be of difference. Certainly, historically, illness has always been a profound threat to the identity and stability of any community. Today, we remove people who are ill from their communities. We take them into healthcare for good reasons in order to treat them. Although, of course, in the pandemic, we had the reverse of that. So we had people who were isolating, who were shielding to keep themselves safe. But if you think back not too long ago to the history of mental or lunatic asylums, we see that much more a negative way of people being ostracized, taken out of society and placed somewhere where we didn't have to think about them, or they may be viewed as subhuman. And again, I can imagine in other settings that some of that same aspect can happen. And against individualistic understandings and definitions of health, more recent definitions of health and wholeness increasingly recognize the importance of our interrelatedness. This is a quote from Wendell Berry. This health is not just a sense of completeness in ourselves, but also in the sense of belonging to others and our place. It is an unconscious awareness of community, of having in common. And I think there's, again, one good thing from the pandemic that I saw was the way that so many churches put their services online and continue to do so, so that patients can connect to their communities and still feel themselves part of a worshipping community by joining online. And then I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to jump to the next slide quickly to give us a bit of space. There's that question of what communities are we inserting someone back into? It's not uncommon when I say to someone, and are there people you are missing? And they talk about missing their dog before a partner or before children. And there might be something about dogs and unconditional love there, but also having a dog tap someone into, I suspect, a range of communities. So there's the ritual of getting up and having to go out for a walk, whatever the weather, of meeting other people who are doing the same thing, and maybe they just nod in recognition, but maybe they've also developed and got to know them over time. So that sense of those multiple communities that we relate to. So I will again pause there, and perhaps if we make these breakout groups slightly shorter, perhaps sort of 7 minutes, and that opportunity just to see again whether there are resonances with what I've been saying, and how you could see liturgy, ritual as a way to respond to the suffering and the distress of people that you encounter. Then we'll come back just for the last bit, and I can pick up with some of the questions that might have arisen. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to read to finish a quote that I've slightly amended from Padraig O'Tuama, which comes from his daily prayer with the Coromila community, and I basically taken the word prayer out and replaced it with the word ritual. But I'm happy to share the slides, and this is effectively the last slide. And so he says, ritual is a small fire lit to keep cold hands warm. Ritual is not an answer always, because not all questions can be answered. Ritual can be a rhythm that helps us make sense in times of senselessness, not offering solutions, but speaking to and from the mystery of humanity. Ritual is rhythm, ritual is comfort, ritual is disappointment, ritual is words and shape and art around desperation and delight and disappointment and desire. So I'll pick up on Amanda's question and then draw to a close. So Amanda in the chat was asking about prayer or offering sort of equivalents, particularly for those from a tradition that might not accept prayer. So I think a couple of ways of responding to that. When I first started working in the hospital, we had a Quaker volunteer, and the Quaker volunteer would often say at the end of an encounter that in his tradition they often held silence, and so could he just hold silence with them for a few moments just to mark that they had been talking about significant events and and deep things. So that would be one way of marking it something that's happened. In the conversations that I've had with the line manager at the hospital where I work, who is a humanist, we've talked about the notion of saying "I wish." So she will sometimes use that to say, again, in the same way of saying, we talked about some deep things. Can I reflect some of this back to you and say, I would wish for you these things. So in a sense, a sort of a prayer, but not actually just addressed to God in that way. So that might be sort of two slightly different ways of doing that. And then I can see Ruth has asked about how does the model translate so chaplaincy offered to staff. And I guess staff may well be experiencing the same type of things if they're going through suffering. So again, thinking about how there might be ways of responding to them. I think it could be applied to them. It would obviously be slightly different, but they would potentially some of those same things happening of feeling their lack of sort of sense of self, and I can imagine some of the things around moral injury, perhaps particularly around that. And again, I can just see another quote when I stuff about vulnerability being overcome. Again, at the College of Healthcare Chaplains conference, we had a very interesting discussion about maybe vulnerability embraced might be a better term for that. I think in terms of Pellegrini and Thomas Merv, because they were talking about the person working, the sort of healthcare person, and the power dynamics, they were wanting to suggest something about an equality or more of an equal. But yes, I think theologically there is something to be said for embracing our vulnerability.